We as a society have finally come to grips with the fact that peak oil is happening and that global warming is happening, and gee, we better do something about it. And of course, being the entrepreneurial people we are, for many people it's a way to make money. And so, I mean, all the way from Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill that are involved in oil palms and ethanol, sugar in Brazil, to Charles Schultz, former Reagan cabinet person, who is now his thing is making money off of out of what's coming. There's a lot of problems coming. He says it's a good way to make a lot of money. So he goes around advising people on how to make money out of what's coming down the pike. And that always disturbs me, because we got in the fix we're in because of greed. And is the answer more of the same thing? I don't think so. So, and I see just some frightfully lunatic reasoning going on here. And so I kind of like to run through, before we get through, different kinds of biofuels, because a lot of them are kind of interchangeable in some ways. Like liquid fuel can come from palm trees, it can come from corn, it can come from wood chips. I mean, there's any number of things that we're talking about as the answer to liquid fuel. So there's a lot of interchangeability here. But let me just start out with corn and chime in anytime you want to. I don't know, what everybody knows here or what everybody would like to know. And so to a certain extent, maybe I can provide you some information here. But I think you're all aware of corn ethanol. And corn ethanol is the answer that's being promoted by the major presidential candidates. It's also probably the stupidest thing we could do. And let me try to explain why. First of all, corn is a disaster environmentally to begin with. And right now, the tremendous amount of corn we produce, mainly goes to support high fructose corn syrup in the soda industry. It goes to promote the animal feeding industry and animal feedlots, and to some extent the corn chip business. In the past, overproduction of corn supported the corn whiskey business back in the early part of the 20th century and produced a nation of drunks. Literally, go back and read the history. It's an interesting history about how much corn alcohol we consumed. But that's what led to temperance. It was just so bad. But that came out of corn, just producing too much corn. Well, now we still produce enormous amounts of corn because it grows like hell. If you fertilize it, it grows like crazy. It's a tremendously fertilizer-responsive crop. But it is also, as far as I know, the crop that produces the most soil erosion, the crop that leaks the most nitrogen into water and the atmosphere. Corn grows very well if it's fertilized heavily, but it's also a very inefficient user of fertilizer. So it only works if you've got, on a big scale, if you've got cheap energy to produce the synthetic fertilizers. And of course, we still do. We still do have cheap energy. And so corn, a very significant percentage of the nitrogen fertilizer you add to make that corn grow leaks out. It leaks out in a couple different ways. It leaks out as nitrates into the water supply. We're realizing a significant component of the leakage is in nitrous oxide. When nitrates accumulate in the soil, all right? If you understand the nitrogen cycle, you know that some of the nitrates that end up in the soil from the breakdown of organic matter get converted back to nitrogen gas, which goes back up into the atmosphere. Right? And then the mechanisms bring it back down again nitrogen fixation, physical and or chemical and biological. But in nature, that breakdown of nitrate to nitrogen is a very small process, very limited process, because nature doesn't leave a lot of excess nitrates in the soil. You know, as organic matter is broken down in the soil, it releases a trickle of nitrates, you know, and those things are very quickly scavenged up by living organisms and go right back into the living system. Well, when you grow corn, you add lots of nitrates to the soil. The plants can't begin to take it up. They take up enough of it to produce a lot of corn, but a lot of it leaks out. And that stuff that leaks out gets into water supplies and becomes used by denitrifying bacteria as an energy source, and they release N2 up into the atmosphere. But they also, at the same time, release N2O. The process is not completely efficient. It's just like when you burn stuff, you get carbon dioxide, but you also get some carbon monoxide. It's a similar kind of thing. You get mostly nitrogen gas, but you also get some N2O. N2O is a greenhouse gas, and it's a powerful one. I was going to look it up and forgot to. Several thousand times, I think, CO2 per molecule. Anybody here can help me out with that? I know maybe it's 200. It's a lot. And so there's this trickle of N2O going up into the atmosphere now from the buildup of nitrates in soils. Okay? That didn't happen before. It happened on a very, very limited scale, almost irrelevant. Now it's significant. Now it's a significant factor in global warming. Well, it turns out that the figures that people were using before for how much N2O was being produced in agriculture are probably off by a factor of 2 or 3. You know, when people started really looking at it closely, they discovered, whoa, we don't have this right. So we're growing corn to turn into ethanol, so we don't. So we're producing renewable energy, and we won't affect CO2 in the atmosphere. But what about the N2O that's going up there? See, so all right, that's part of it. Another part of it is the high level of soil erosion. Corn is the worst. I don't know, it's probably at least 20 times soil formation rates, erosion off of corn typically, because corn's a row crop. And even in the best of circumstances, you've got exposed soil. It's an annual row crop. And you can limit it, but even in the best of circumstances, you're still going to have significant amounts of erosion. You're still going to have significant amounts of fertilizer, nitrate leakage, N2O leakage up into the atmosphere. This is the best of circumstances, okay? This is what we're proposing to do, all right? So why are we really doing it? I think some of you probably know. We're really doing it because of Cargill and Archer-Daniels-Midland. These are two monster grain traders who are cleaning up on the corn business. They are cleaning up on corn subsidies, and because they're able to get the corn cheap, at the same time they're cleaning up on the 51 cent a gallon subsidies to ethanol production. They're winning at both ends. They're producing the ethanol from the subsidized corn, and they are cleaning up. And do you think they care whether or not this is a logical solution? Not in the least. Right? I forgot to mention one of the really key things to it is the fact that corn ethanol is barely a net energy producer. Barely. In fact, it may not be. You know, it depends on who you listen to. The best estimates indicate that you might get 1.3 calories of ethanol for 1 calorie of fossil fuel invested in the growing of the corn. That's the high end. Other people say it's below 1. Other people say it's a net loss. So why in hell would we be promoting something that's aggravating soil erosion, that's aggravating nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, that's barely a net energy producer? Why would we be doing this? Politics, Archer-Daniels-Midland, Cargill, they make big bucks, they feed big bucks back into the political system, and so you have Obama and you have Hillary Clinton pushing for corn ethanol. It's just the crudest kind of stupidity that I can imagine. It's not quite as dumb as what's going on in the White House now. It takes fossil fuels to grow corn. It takes fossil fuels to produce the synthetic fertilizers. It takes fossil fuels to produce the pesticides. It takes fossil fuels to run the tractors, to cultivate the land. It takes fossil fuels to make the tractors, and so on. And when you add that all up, again, it depends upon who's doing the adding and how they're doing it, and you get into something called boundaries of consideration. How far do you go in calculating your energy costs? It goes as low as 0.8 for every 1 N, depending on, that's what David Pimentel says up at Cornell. But people generally are willing to accept a slight net gain. So it's really a horrible solution, and the ramifications of it just go on and on. One of Jack gave me Davis gave me a copy, or forwarded me an article which I'd already read from the Bay Journal. It's a great journal. You all ought to get it. Looking at the consequences of corn ethanol to the Susquehanna Basin. It's damn serious, because what's happened is people are switching to corn in huge quantities to make money. The farmers follow the money. The industrial farmers follow the money. And so something like 300,000 or 400,000 acres are switching to corn this year, and that means a whole slug of nitrates going into the Chesapeake that didn't go in before. And it's basically going to counteract an enormous, an awful lot of the progress that's been made in reducing nitrates going into the bay. And in estuarine systems, nitrates are the key, not phosphates. So this is real serious. This is real serious for the Chesapeake Bay, but there's no regulations. You can do anything you want to, right? And with the government subsidizing and pushing this as a lunatic solution to whatever, but again, the answer of why they're doing it can be seen very clearly in who's making money off of it, not by whether it's a logical thing to do. So we can kind of start out with that. And it could go on and on. I think some of you know, if you want to link something else in here, that our emphasis on corn ethanol is starting to produce real hunger in the world already, because the price of corn has taken off. And, well, this goes back, and get me going on this. The U.S. subsidizes corn, okay? So that it costs farmers, it used to, the game has changed a lot because of the price increase, but it used to cost farmers $2.50 to grow ethanol, $2.50 a bushel, and it sold for $1.50 because the overproduction was so high. So U.S. farmers were selling, or corn was going to Mexico. They were able to produce it that low, and they were able to undersell Mexican farmers, okay? I mean, Mexican farmers can't do it for nothing. So they were able to, when NAFTA went into effect, they were able to undersell Mexican farmers. Several million Mexican corn farmers went belly up, went into Mexico City like everybody does, became part of this big conurbation there. So the Mexicans were getting large amounts of corn from the United States because we were subsidizing it. Is that right under free trade? No, it's not. But we can do what we want to because we're bigger than them. And so we subsidize stuff under free trade. So so now the price has gone up to something like $4 a bushel, something like that. And now the Mexicans now had to, the price of corn has gone up so much coming in from the U.S. that many Mexicans can't afford it now, and they can't produce their own because 2 or 3 million farmers went out of business. So now they're caught. They're caught. So the effects ramify. It gets even worse than that. Maybe Pam will want to add to this, but it raises the price of grain every place. Because if more farmers are growing corn, fewer farmers are growing wheat or oats, so the price of those goes up. So farmers all over the place are trying to figure out how to deal with these skyrocketing grain prices because so much grain is going to produce ethanol. We're producing a liquid fuel to run vehicles and instead of food. But I've had several conversations with farmers in Vermont and here that are talking about this. They're trying to figure out how they're going to farm now. One farmer up in Vermont was telling me it's getting hard to get certain kinds of seed grains because the seed farmers in the Midwest are switching over to corn because that's what the market is, and they're not growing millet and things like this, and so you can't get some of these more unusual grains. The market for ethanol it just spirals all over the place. So ethanol is a good place to start. Corn ethanol, but we could talk about some others that are interesting. Why don't we could go with sugar cane, all right? Sugar cane is energetically is much more efficient. That's what, 8 to 1 or something. I mean, it's very efficient that way. It's not too bad for soil erosion because the ground is covered most of the time when you grow sugar cane, and the idea of burning ethanol from sugar cane is being promoted by some people as a great way for a certain amount of fairness in trade, because the people in the tropics can use their competitive advantage, which is warm soil, warm climate, plenty of water, to grow sugar cane, and then that can be traded, or they can use it to grow soybeans. Yeah, Scott.
I just want to throw in, and I know you know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Brazil's doing that big time.
Big time, yeah. Well, yeah, Brazil's into it big time now. And so, well, I mean, maybe that's okay. Sugar cane isn't as demanding in fertilizer. But on the other hand, the growing of sugar cane is rather horrendous socially. People are paid next to nothing. It's a terrible way to make a living, is working in a sugar cane plantation. When they burn the cane, it produces enormous amounts of pollution. And yet, would that bother us? You know, it's happening someplace else. But I know that people don't work in cane fields unless they can't find anything else. It's a crappy job. It's a crappy job. And and yet we're advocating this as a source of ethanol. So I think that one of the things we really have blinders on in this whole fuel business is a social justice component. You know, who the hell wants to worry about social justice when they're filling up their gas tank, right? Well, we never have before, but I mean, we could have a long philosophical discussion about how you can't continue to rely upon the abuse of poor people in the world forever. But the production of sugar cane is in part involved with that. Sugar cane is also a highly concentrated industry in Brazil. It's the sugar cane land is in the hands of a very few landowners, so this tends to promote this large-scale farming, concentration of wealth. Brazil has the biggest rich-poor gap in the Western Hemisphere, as far as I know. It has a small number of relatively wealthy, huge landowners, and the vast majority of people in Brazil are poor. This will feed right into that process and reinforce it. It'll make the rich richer and the poor poorer. You hear this stuff where people say, well, we're not going to use any good land, we're just going to use bad land that's not good for anything else. Does anybody think there's actually bad land out there that's going to grow large amounts of stuff that can be used economically efficiently? I mean, what kind of crops do we have that'll grow on land that nothing else will grow on? You know, I mean, it's a wonderful mythology, but I don't know of any crops like that. And by and large, if land will grow something fairly decently, it's already growing something. You know, it's not like we got huge amounts of land sitting down there waiting for this crop to come along and start producing vast amounts of fuel. It's not going to happen. So you're displacing something else, just like we're doing right now with corn. We're displacing something else when we grow the corn. People are making economic decisions to grow corn, or in the case of Brazil, they're making economic decisions to grow sugarcane. In the case of Argentina and Brazil, they're making economic decisions to grow soybeans over vast areas of land, which end up creating large amounts of deforestation, actually. Large amounts of, particularly in Brazil, as I understand it. So, but to what extent the people in Europe are aware of this, I don't know. I just don't know. I suspect they're beginning to become aware of it, but that's one of the consequences of growing soybeans. All right. So, corn and sugarcane are the big sort of sugar ethanol kinds of crops. But we don't need to do that. We'll do cellulosic ethanol. Right? All right. Cellulosic ethanol involves a process by which you can actually convert cellulose into ethanol. Now it has to be starch or sugar. Basically, sugar is what you're using. But what the idea is now is to get bacteria that will efficiently break down cellulose and turn it into ethanol. Okay? Now, we don't have that system perfected yet. But if we do, we'll be able to use switchgrass. How many have heard of switchgrass? All right, the great answer. Switchgrass is going to solve everything. All right, or wood. We can use anything. Anything that's got cellulose in it. It turns out that for some reason or another, hardwoods are better than conifers. So maybe the Great White North is safe. We can use the Great White North to produce paper, and then we can use the rest of the world to produce cellulosic ethanol. Well, first of all, the process isn't perfected. But the thing, this is where it gets really scary. We're genetically modifying bacteria to break down cellulose. You want that stuff getting out of the cellulosic ethanol factory into the environment? And do you think the people that are doing this are worried about that? And do you trust the regulatory system to check it? I don't. I mean, the arrogance of the people that do this stuff is just beyond measure. Oh, it's not a problem. Well, it's a problem for me. I don't want this stuff getting out in the environment. But we'll return later to sort of this whole biomass kind of thinking. All right, talk a little bit about biodiesel. All right, and we'll pass quickly over cooking oil, and we'll let the 0.0001% of the population that can run their cars on McDonald's French fry oil be happy. But obviously, anybody knows that has nothing to do with anything except a very small, very trickle of stuff. But with biodiesel, we're talking about growing, and already are growing, large quantities of crops for the specific purpose of getting the oil out of them and running vehicles on them. The major crops that are being used for this are oil palms and soybeans, okay? And to some extent, canola, all right? Sunflower, you can use anything. You can use anything, but I think, the big ones, I think, at this point, I think are mostly soy and oil palms with some canola. I think canola may be a major player in Germany right now. But the idea is you grow the crop simply to press the oil out of it and then use that. And you get something left over. You get soy meal, which then you can feed the animals, I guess. But what's wrong with that? Well, I kind of run down. I already talked a little bit about soybeans. Soybeans are the biggest producers in the world, or I guess the U.S., Brazil, Argentina. Most of it's done with GMOs. GMOs and glyphosate, the herbicide, the Monsanto dynamic duo. That was Monsanto's breakthrough. Some of you know that Monsanto 10, 15 years ago started to buy up seed companies. I mean, they're a chemical company. They were into making Agent Orange and DDT and a few other things, nerve gases and stuff like that. But they were worried about the long-term market for the herbicides, so they developed this approach of buying up seed companies, producing genetically modified organisms that would grow would produce more profit using herbicides to control weeds. Not more soy, more profits. They don't produce more soy, but that's another story. And so they sell the combination. You get the seeds and the herbicides, and they go together. In Brazil, large, significant amounts of land has been cleared to grow more soybeans, and this is land that was forested. It wasn't wasteland. And in fact, Brazil had a little trick of actually reclassifying or classifying a large amount of land in Brazil as being sort of wasteland, and they just sort of did that, and it isn't at all. I mean, it's perfectly good forest and all. They just classified it that way so you could then use it to grow soybeans on. So that's a major issue. Another interesting issue with soy, which I didn't quite realize until I started doing a little hunting around on this subject. Growing soybeans has about the lowest labor requirements of any crop you can grow. It takes almost no labor to grow soy. It's done almost entirely with large-scale mechanization and chemicals. And so when you go into an area and basically take it over for large-scale soy farming, you put all kinds of farm labor out of business because there's nothing for them to do. And basically all the money flows out of that region someplace else. You know, people come from outside with the big equipment to drive the big equipment. The seeds and the chemicals come from Monsanto. All the money's coming in and going out, and very little circulates within the community. So it's a great way to impoverish an area is to grow soybeans. And where do all these people go that lose their jobs? They go into the cities, just like they do every place else. So many of these biomass type fuels, biofuels, have that effect. You can produce a lot of calories with very little human input. Right? You can do the same thing growing eucalyptus. Right? Doesn't take much human labor to grow eucalyptus plantations. And they grow like crazy, and then you harvest them with big machines and take, or presumably, and then take them off. So this is a huge problem with growing this stuff, is it displaces traditional subsistence systems with large-scale systems in which the money flows right up to the top. So in the long run, that's kind of a problem. You know, we don't live in a world where we have lots of it, where we don't have enough labor, and we need to save lots of labor. We live in a world where people need jobs, and yet these crops, by and large, don't facilitate that. So that's an interesting limitation with soy, both the deforestation, which of course puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in large-scale quantities, to grow soy, which supposedly saves it. The worst abuse by far, though, is palm oil. Oil palms, and that's the big one now. That's one that's taken off. Oil palms, well, I mean, I'm very familiar with them because we see them in Costa Rica all the time. We drive up and down this road all the time, and this road we drive on has 50 kilometers of oil palms along it, on both sides, with an occasional short interruption for a little village, and then more oil palms. And it's a biological desert. They drained the area to grow them. Originally they grew bananas, and when the bananas failed, they switched to oil palms. It's a terrible place to work. This shows up in an interesting way. Costa Ricans are higher on the scale economically than anybody else in Central America. So when you have a real crappy job in Costa Rica, the Costa Ricans won't do it. And instead, who does it? Nicaraguans. And so when you drive down this road, you can tell, as soon as you get into these oil palm plantations, you start seeing Nicaraguans. How do I know? They're different. They have a strong indigenous influence. They look Indian. They're darker. You can tell right away they're Nicaraguans. And they're there because they'll work under these lousy conditions with chemicals and dirt, and the Costa Ricans won't do it. That's oil palm plantations, besides producing a biological desert. And, all right, in the case of Indonesia, what's particularly horrifying here is they're cutting down tropical rainforests to plant oil palms. Because economically, they make more money. Okay? And it gets even worse than that, because not only are they cutting down tropical rainforests, but they're actually, in that part of the world, I think this is actually in Malaysia, the Borneo part of Malaysia, they're actually large peatlands, which is kind of surprising. I'd like to see them, but by the time I get there, they'll probably be gone. Large swamps with lots of peat in them and forests growing on them that are being drained to grow oil palms. So what this does is it puts the carbon from the trees up in the atmosphere, but it also puts the carbon from the peat up into the atmosphere too. So this doubles or triples the amount of carbon goes up into the atmosphere just to start growing the oil palms to produce the biodiesel fuel. This is what's happening. Large-scale deforestation, and it's actually a major contributor to CO2 to the atmosphere, not a reverser of the process. But again, it's economics that counts. And who's into this? I think this is ADM that's into this. Cargill's big in Brazil. Cargill's big in soybeans, and they're also involved in sugarcane. So, because there's money to be made. All right. All right. Well, let me talk a little bit about wood chips. Because in a way, this kind of disturbs me as much as anything. And it disturbs me, this has been kind of a real pet peeve of mine for a while. The idea that there's waste in nature. Okay? Now, if you know anything about ecology, you know that there is no waste in nature. But most people don't understand that. They think that if you go into a forest and you cut out 25% of the trees, you haul out the logs, and you leave the tops in the woods, you've wasted the tops. And they get all upset. Oh, that forest looks awful. All those tops are in the forest. They're wasted. Somebody could have used them. Why couldn't we use them? It's not a waste to nature. It's carbon. It's nitrogen. It's phosphorus. It goes back into the soil. It maintains soil carbon levels so the soil actually works like a soil. If you want to wreck a soil over the long run, just don't let anything go back into it. Just be as clean as you can. Take everything out and put nothing back. And this is what biomass harvesting is all about. Because when you start talking about burning wood chips for fuel, when you start talking about taking wood chips and using them, putting them into some sort of a vat and turning them into ethanol and using it to run vehicles with, you're talking about a process that has no requirement whatsoever for quality in what goes in. Basically, all you need is a big lawnmower. Just head for the forest, just chop it up, put it in a truck and drive it away. All right? And so from a forester's standpoint, from some of them anyway, this is great. Now we can go into a forest and we can take out the good stuff, and then we can take out everything else and use it for wood chips. Well, what are you doing to the forest? You're slowly running it downhill. Now, maybe not in your immediate lifetime, but you've started a process that will do it. Now, because if you take, and don't put back, see? I just love the reasoning. That if a tree isn't nice and straight and has nice boards in it, then it's no good. We ought to get rid of it. I don't think nature thinks that way. I mean, there is no such process in nature. I mean, you think the flying squirrels that live in the holes in the trees are just saying, well, I really shouldn't live here. This is a bad tree, or the raccoons or the wood ducks or things like that. They don't think that way. Or the chipmunks or whatever's in there. They don't think this way, and yet the use of wood chips thinks this way. Okay, and when you need as your input to your process this lowest common denominator product, it's the greatest incentive I've ever seen for really bad forestry. Because what is there to counter it? What is there to counter it? Regulations? I don't know of a state in the union that regulates forestry on private lands. I don't know of a single state. I'd love for somebody to find one. I'd like to see the example. But they sure don't in this state. You can do anything you want to. If you've got a forest, you can go in there and level it. 10 years later, you can level it again. 10 years later, you can level it again. The only thing you can't do is build a logging road that actually disturbs your neighbors. And even that you can do in most places. You can't do it in Vestal if you get caught. You can do it in Vestal if you don't get caught, because we had a logging job right next to the university that built a bad logging road, and the only reason they had to fix it is because I called them on it, and they made me go and tell the code enforcement officer what to do. So there's basically no regulation on private lands. This is viewed as sort of a short-term bonanza. That we can there'll now be a market for the stuff that's cleared out. They can be used as biofuels. I don't know. But that has been, that's been talked about, because people say, well, what are you going to do with all this stuff? There's no incentive to do this clearing because there's no money to be made. Yeah, well, supposedly it's renewable. I mean, the tree, you burn it at the same time where you cut the tree, another tree is growing, so it's supposed to be. If you leave enough carbon in the soil. But this is virtually undiscussed. It's virtually undiscussed. There seems to be no awareness that past civilizations have used their forests up. I mean, this is not something that might happen. It has happened a number of times. We're quite capable of using up our forests until there's nothing left. Right? It takes longer in some places. An interesting place to look at, if you want to see how fast it can happen, is the tropics. Because everything happens faster down there. Things grow faster, they decay faster, and so forth. Well, one of the big things down there in Costa Rica now, or was for a while, was planting a really fast-growing tree called Melina, M-E-L-I-N-A. And Melina grows so fast, and it gets about this big in 7 years. I mean, I've seen, they can put on like 2 inches in a year in good conditions. That's a little bit unusual, more likely an inch, something like that. So the idea with Melina is it grows like crazy and it sprouts. So you just, after 7 years, it's big enough. You go in, whack it down, chip it up, haul it away. It grows back again. Magic. It's renewable. Sustainable. Is it? How many times can you do it? Nobody's studying that. But I ran into a forester down there who I respect, and we were talking about this, and I says, what do you think? How many times can you do this? With Melina or teak, these are two trees that will do this. How many times can you do this? And then still have them come back again. He said 2, maybe 3. So if you're growing Melina, that gets you 20 years and you can wreck the place. I mean, it can happen that fast. Up here, it takes longer, of course. It might take you 100 years, depending on how fast you're cutting things. If you're doing it for wood chips, you can cut them a lot faster because you don't care what it is. You don't care. I mean, I just have this vision of expansion of wood chip burning things and people going into all of these second growth red maple, white ash stands that we have around here with trees this big around it, just starting up the machine and going in there and just flattening the place. Because that's the most economical way to do it. Who the hell is going to go in there and do selective logging to sell wood chips, which they're going to have to sell at a low price? You're not going to selective log. You could, but you're not going to because it's not going to be efficient. I ran into a guy, well, several people heard him, Fisk heard him, this guy named Albert Bates that was here last weekend. And I got to talking to him about if he had any experience with this kind of harvesting for wood chips. He's from Tennessee, and he says, oh yeah. He says, they're doing it down where I am. And he went through his computer and pulled out about 3 slides of what the forest looked like after they went in and harvested it for wood chips. But pretty much like a bomb had hit it. Like everything was just flattened as far as you could see. That's what they do for wood chips. He described the machine, which is one I've never seen before. It's a machine with a big arm that goes out and actually is capable of munching a tree from the top down and chipping it up as it goes and throwing the chips through a tube into a truck. I haven't seen that one yet. I've seen pictures of feller bunchers and forwarders and things. I've never seen this machine before. This is the ultimate machine in maximizing the speed with which you can pull wood out of the forest. And you'll do it, and it'll pay off if it makes no difference what quality you have. All you want is tonnage, right? Because that's all you're doing. You're just burning it. Or in the future, you're just going to chip it. You're just going to turn it into ethanol. So, you tell me, what is going to stop this from being a mess? Can anybody think of the process that's going to keep this from being an ecological disaster? I can't think of one. If you want to know what I would say would be the optimum thing to do, it would be wind, just more wind, and particularly off-sea wind. But any place, I'm not real sympathetic to people who are upset about their views being wrecked. If they start walking every place, then I'll be a little bit more sympathetic, or stop, burning electric lights or whatever. But it is a tough call. It is a tough call. We have dug a very deep hole. I get the biggest kick out of our university that, has under the gun from the governor to use 20% clean energy, I think it is. So what's their clean energy? These freaking little electric cars that run around the place. Well, as long as nobody thinks about mountaintop removal, I guess it's clean.
But I'm not suggesting
coal. No, I know, but how much electricity can you get in how quick a period of time from wind and solar? You see, this is a problem. We don't have 50 years to make the transition. We got maybe 10, if we're lucky. Anybody here live in Vestal?
Little town.
You willing to flatten Vestal?
You can find a train station.
Yeah, you willing to flatten Vestal? Vestal is basically uninhabitable, except with cars. I can't think of how anybody could live in it without cars. You might be able to live in Binghamton, some places in it, because you could walk or bike or whatever. You can't do anything in Vestal without a car. But Vestal basically is designed around the car. So what are you going to do with all this infrastructure? I don't know. Let me just talk a little bit about wood. I just played around with a few numbers with wood, and as to what you can get out of wood. I found some numbers on how many kilowatts you can produce with how much wood, and I discovered that on average it takes about 6 acres per person per year for the average person's electricity. 6 acres worth of supposedly renewable yield from wood, right? And this is taking the power company's estimates of how much it would take to fuel a 50 megawatt power plant, which they have in Burlington. So I kind of took those and did a little bit of conversion, and came up with that number, 6 acres per person per year to burn to generate the electricity used. I estimate it would also take someplace around that number if you used wood for home heat. Now, this assumes that by then oil is skyrocketed, so you can't afford oil or natural gas anymore, so now you're going to be burning wood for your home heat. So if if you take that assumption, so you're talking maybe a dozen acres a person wood yield per year, okay? And let's just take a part of upstate New York, 5 million people. We would use 50 million acres worth of wood to do this. And of course, we're not even driving vehicles yet. I mean, that's got to come from someplace else. That turns out to be a square 275 miles on a side. And of course, we got how many people in New York? 15, 20 million, something like that. So, in other words, it's not possible to do it for New York. It just isn't possible. But it's interesting to do the math. This is something that it makes sense for Vermont. It makes sense for New Hampshire, where there's lots, compared to the number of people, there are lots of trees. When you start getting into more populated areas, there simply isn't enough wood. And so it might be part of a solution, but even then, I really worry about it. And because again, as I say, what is going to prevent bad forestry? And who's going to ask questions about how much can we cut and still maintain soil quality? I was talking with my students the other day in my fall class, and when I teach about agriculture in the spring, I often say that if you think about nitrogen and conserving nitrogen, and that's your goal as a farmer, that's all you think about, you'll be a good farmer. If you can conserve nitrogen, everything else will fall into place. I think for forestry, it's probably carbon. If you think, how can I practice forestry in such a way that I conserve carbon levels in the soil, that I'm not slowly draining carbon from the system? Because as you drain carbon from the system, the soils don't work as well. Because it's carbon in the form of humus that creates that good soil structure that makes soils work. If you slowly pull that down, it works a little bit worse each year, and eventually your forests aren't working anymore. But I don't think people are asking these questions. I don't think they are. I think they just sort of assume if they cut a tree down, another one grows. That's okay. But I'm going to try and get some answers. I have a friend who's on actually the board of Burlington Electric in Vermont, and I'm going to feed him questions. And he said, well, they told us they have 4 foresters working for them. And I said, what's that got to do with anything? I mean, a forester's job can simply be to go find the wood. It may have nothing at all to do with, how it's harvested. Absolutely nothing. So I'm going to try and find this out. But it's going to be interesting because we're going to see people increasingly turning to wood in various ways. You're going to, we're not too far off. I remember back in the early 70s, there was actually a modest expansion in wood usage. I remember very distinctly, and I think about this somewhat often, when I moved here in '73, and I started to buy wood to burn. Initially, it was in a fireplace because I didn't know any better, but eventually got a wood stove, so then it made sense, and I was actually heating my house efficiently with wood. I was paying $25 a face cord in 1976. All right? What's it now?
65.
65. All right. What should it be if you were paying the same price as you were dollar-wise, real dollars, in 1976?
It's a lot more than that.
At least 100. At least 100 or more. So, and people weren't getting rich then, but nowadays, I don't know why anybody would cut wood. So don't be surprised to see wood take off to be, you know, $300 a quart or something in a couple of years. As fuel prices creep up enough that people start making decisions to switch over to wood, and then that limited market gets saturated immediately. The supply gets cleaned up immediately. I'll probably have to do something else. Right now, I heat off of junk wood I pick up off the curb. So it costs me nothing. So that's about as cheap as you can get. But that won't happen. I don't think that'll happen more another year or two. And this time it won't go back. You know, this time we're not going to reverse. We're not going to go back to cheap oil again. And this time it's going to be for the long term. The oil is basically, to me, it's a non-issue because we got 10 more years maybe, and then we're going to have to do something. So it's not like, do we go biofuels or do oil? We're going to do something. It's just that the only real answer has got to involve a radical decrease in our use of. And that's true for more than one reason. I mean, it's true if you're talking fossil fuels as far as global warming and running out of the material. But if you start saying, well, we just switched to biofuels, the cost of using biofuels, social, environmental, and so forth, are so high that even if they're not adding CO2, we still shouldn't do it. We still should use as little as possible. But boy, it's hard to tell people that, you know? I mean, I'm going to keep, you know, I'll stop driving my SUV when you take it out of my cold dead hand. Or, you know, I mean, you know, go back to paraphrase another saying that was popular a while back. Maybe still is, for all I know. It's hard, you know. We all tend to view life as kind of going on the way it is, and find a way to do it. And that's what politicians do. They promise, I'm not going to upset you. Imagine running for president and saying, we're in deep trouble. You got to get off your butts and do stuff, and it's, get rid of this guy, you know. I don't want to have anything to do with him. So that's why I say I don't know if the political system can actually deal with it. It may have to break down in some other way. The people that think about technical solutions don't think about social context. They're not concerned about massive unemployment in Argentina or people starving in Mexico. That's not their problem. And yet, it's not asking those questions, really, that basically led to the downfall of the Mesopotamian civilization, the downfall of the Greek civilization.